In the burning heart of the desert, where the Nile carved its winding path like a divine thread stitching life into the land, a child was born into the house of the sun. She would grow up to rule an empire. But when she came into the world, no prophecy was spoken, no comet crossed the sky. Her birth was not greeted with trumpets or thunder, only the quiet breath of a mother who knew the weight of her lineage. Her name was Hatshepsut, daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I and Queen Ahmose, descended from a line believed to be touched by the gods themselves. Her blood ran with the memory of Ra. Her bones were shaped by divine order. In Egypt, this meant something. In Egypt, it meant everything. The year was around 1507 BCE, and Egypt was emerging from the chaos of previous dynasties. The Middle Kingdom had faded into memory, and the New Kingdom was still carving out its place in the sands of time. It was an era perched between glory and collapse, where every successor had to prove the gods still walked among men, or risk losing the mandate of heaven entirely. Thutmose I was such a man, a warrior pharaoh who had risen not by birthright but by merit and force. He expanded Egypt's borders deep into Nubia and pushed against the chaos of the Near East. And yet, for all his conquest, what secured his legacy was the union with Queen Ahmose, a woman of impeccable royal bloodline. From her womb would come legitimacy. From her womb would come continuity. Hatshepsut grew up not merely as a princess but as a symbol, a living guarantee that the blood of the gods would not be diluted. In the hallowed halls of Karnak and the shaded courtyards of Thebes, she learned the language of power. She memorized hymns to Ammonius, mastered the sacred rituals of Ma'at, and observed the machinery of rule with an intelligence far sharper than most men at court. Egypt, for all its rituals and pageantry, was a place of systems, of scribes, priests, tax collectors, generals, and farmers. She understood this machinery not as a spectacle but as a structure, one that could be navigated, shaped, and eventually ruled. She was not the only child of Thutmose I, but she was the only one born of a great royal wife. That distinction mattered. Pharaohs had many children by many women, but only those born to principal queens could lay claim to uncontested legitimacy. This reality would later serve her, but in childhood, it cast her as both privileged and isolated. She was not raised to be a queen. She was raised to be a keeper of order, a bridge between gods and mortals, and, though no one would admit it aloud, perhaps something more. In the temples of Karnak, among the chants of incense-bearing priests, Hatshepsut encountered Ammonius, not merely as a god but as a companion. Later in her reign, she would claim he was her true father, that on a sacred night, Ammonius had taken the form of Thutmose I and laid with her mother, conceiving a child destined to rule. This wasn't just myth-making. In ancient Egypt, divine parentage was a legal strategy, a way to bypass blood politics with theology. But even as a child, before any of that could be weaponized, she felt the gravity of her identity. She belonged to something larger than herself. The temples whispered it. The walls told it in hieroglyphs before she could even read them. She watched her father rule with force and clarity. She traveled with him, rare for a young girl, on processions, on military reviews, on temple inaugurations. While other princesses remained behind palace walls, she stood beside her father as he addressed priests and generals alike. It wasn't affection. It was preparation. Thutmose I had no surviving sons of full royal blood when Hatshepsut was a child. Whether he truly believed she could one day rule is lost to history, but the access he granted her shaped a mind capable of more than ceremony. It shaped a leader. As Hatshepsut grew, so too did Egypt's ambitions. New temples rose from the stone like promises to the gods. Obelisks were carved and raised in her father's name. Gold flowed in from Nubia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, incense from the south. Egypt stood as the world's great beacon, a civilization of order amid a sea of instability. But order, like the Nile, could recede. And beneath the rituals, tensions always brewed. The court was a place of ambition, jealousy, and calculated silence. Even as a child, she knew how to listen for what was not said. She learned the power of watching, of silence as strategy. She was eventually named God's wife of Ammonius, a title both religious and political. It meant she was married symbolically to the most powerful deity in the pantheon. It gave her access to vast temple wealth and political influence, allowing her to act in religious and civic affairs alike. For other royal women, this was a ceremonial honor. For Hatshepsut, it was a platform, a base of operations, a declaration of presence. And then came the shift. Her father died. The throne passed not to her, but to a younger half-brother, Thutmose II, the son of a secondary wife. To secure his rule, he was married to Hatshepsut, sister and brother, wife and queen. In Egypt, this was normal. In Hatshepsut's mind, it was a demotion, not because of the marriage, but because the throne had passed to a man she saw as weaker, less rightful. She did what she was expected to do. She became queen. She gave birth to a daughter. She stood beside Thutmose II at public ceremonies. But behind the scenes, she wielded the knowledge, the contacts, and the authority that came from her upbringing. In truth, she never gave up her ambition. She only adjusted its timing. As the years passed, her husband proved ineffective. Illness, or weakness of spirit, it is hard to know which limited his ability to rule. Ministers stepped in. So did Hatshepsut. Decisions began passing through her hands. Religious dedications bore her name alongside his. When he died, still young, his son by another concubine, Thutmose III, was a mere child. The court panicked. Power was again in transition. The question wasn't who the next pharaoh would be. It was who would rule in his name until he came of age. The answer was obvious. Hatshepsut had already been ruling in everything but title. Now, she became regent. But regency is a hallway, not a throne. It has an end. Hatshepsut knew that. She walked that hallway with grace, gathering allies, tightening her grip on the court, weaving a narrative not just of stewardship but of destiny. She wasn't merely holding power. She was preparing to claim it. The girl born of gods had become a woman of ambition. Egypt watched. The gods watched. The walls of Karnak whispered again. But this time, they asked a question. What if Pharaoh did not have to be a man? And somewhere deep within the stones, the answer began to take form. The death of Thutmose II cast a long, uncertain shadow over the royal court. Though he had worn the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, his reign had been short and weak, marred by illness and political indecision. What remained in his wake was a boy barely old enough to walk confidently through the halls of Karnak. Thutmose III, the son of a lesser wife and, by royal decree, the heir to a kingdom he was too young to rule. It was in this vacuum, in the slow and silent drift of power from one pair of hands to another, that Hatshepsut stepped into her second role, not merely as queen consort, but as regent. What began as an act of familial duty soon evolved into something far more formidable. The regency was a mask she wore with precision. At first, she remained in the background, issuing decrees in the young king's name, keeping up the appearance that Egypt still belonged to the bloodline of the god Horus through its rightful male heir. But behind the ceremonies and the official inscriptions, the gears of power were shifting. Temple priests, military leaders, scribes, and treasurers, those who truly ran the empire, began to defer to her judgment, not the boys. In private council meetings, it was her voice that outlined policy, her seal that ratified royal decisions, her vision that directed resources. And it wasn't just her influence that grew. Her image began to change too. Statues commissioned in these early years subtly elevated her above the traditional depiction of a regent. She was no longer simply the great royal wife. She appeared as a divine intermediary, a woman chosen by the gods to guide Egypt through its uncertainty. Slowly, but with meticulous intention, she began to lay the groundwork for a transformation that had no precedent in the annals of Egyptian history. A woman ascending to the role of pharaoh. It was not a decision taken lightly. Egypt had never seen a female pharaoh who ruled with full royal titles and divine legitimacy, not in the fashion Hatshepsut envisioned. The mythos of kingship was deeply masculine. entwined with the very essence of order and cosmic balance, Ma'at. But Hatshepsut was not trying to break the system. She was adapting it, reshaping the framework of tradition so that her reign could fit snugly within its boundaries. She presented herself not as a woman challenging the order, but as its ultimate protector, an embodiment of stability at a time when instability loomed. The priests of Ammonius were instrumental in this transformation. By reinforcing her divine connection to the god Ammonius, Hatshepsut ensured that her authority stemmed not merely from blood, but from the gods themselves. In temple walls and monumental inscriptions, a new origin story emerged. The god Ammonius himself had taken the form of her father and sired her, thus making her not only a daughter of royalty, but a daughter of divinity. This myth, once engraved into stone and repeated in sacred rites, sealed her spiritual right to ascend the throne. When the transition finally came, it was wrapped in ceremony and symbolic rebirth. Hatshepsut did not simply become pharaoh. She was transformed. She took on a new throne name, Motker, meaning truth is the soul of the sun god Ra. She adopted the royal regalia, the shendit kilt, the false beard, the Nemes headdress, and in sculpture after sculpture, she was depicted not as a woman with feminine curves, but as a masculine ruler, broad-chested, commanding, timeless. It was not an act of denial but a political statement. By presenting herself as male in form, she asserted continuity with the 18 dynasties that preceded her. Not all accepted this transition without resistance. There were factions within the priesthood and the military that questioned her claim. There were whispers that her ascension was unnatural, that she had usurped the rightful king. But Hatshepsut, ever the strategist, never denied Thutmose III his position. She made him a co-ruler in name, even as she wielded absolute power. She gave him titles and a place in rituals, yet ensured that all real authority flowed through her hands. It was a delicate balance, appeasing traditionalists while building a new model of rule. Meanwhile, the nation itself began to transform under her leadership. With internal politics stabilized, Hatshepsut turned her gaze outward. The military campaigns that had defined earlier pharaohs gave way to diplomacy and commerce. She commissioned expeditions to far-off lands, seeking not conquest but trade. In her court, foreign emissaries were received with reverence, and in the streets of Thebes, spices, exotic animals, and rare woods became symbols of her global reach. Chief among these ventures was the legendary expedition to the land of Punt, a journey that would come to define her reign. Though the exact location of Punt remains a mystery to historians, to the Egyptians it was a place of great wealth and sacred connection. Preparations for the voyage were monumental. Shipbuilders along the Nile worked day and night crafting massive vessels, their hulls reinforced for the long journey across the Red Sea. Scribes compiled detailed inventories of trade goods, and priests blessed the fleet in ceremonies that invoked the favor of the gods. The expedition itself was a triumph. Laden with incense trees, myrrh, ivory, ebony, and gold, the ships returned to Thebes to great fanfare. Reliefs depicting the journey were carved into the walls of the temple of el-Bahari, immortalizing not only the exotic wealth of Punt, but also the glory of the pharaoh who had made it possible. These images were more than just records. They were propaganda of the highest order, reinforcing Hatshepsut's legitimacy and divine favor. The temple of el-Bahari itself was a testament to her ambition and vision. Carved into the cliffs along the west bank of the Nile, it was unlike any other royal monument of its time. Its terraces rose in perfect symmetry, connected by grand ramps, flanked by colonnades, and adorned with statues of Hatshepsut in the guise of Osiris, the god of resurrection. It served as both a mortuary temple and a declaration of eternal sovereignty. Every inch of its stone echoed with the message that her reign was not only legitimate but ordained by heaven. Yet power, no matter how divinely sanctioned, comes with its own burdens. Within the royal court, tensions simmered. Thutmose III was growing older, more aware of his role as pharaoh in title but not in function. His supporters, particularly among the military, grumbled at the dominance of a ruler they could not fully embrace. Hatshepsut knew this discontent would only grow, but rather than stifle it through repression, she focused on creating a legacy so vast and enduring that no future successor could easily erase her. She initiated a building campaign that spanned all of Egypt, from Nubia to the Delta. Obelisks rose in Karnak, each one taller than the last, gilded with electrum to catch the rays of Ra. Temples were expanded, roads repaired, and provincial governors empowered to report directly to her. She restored shrines that had fallen into disrepair, won the loyalty of local priesthoods, and ensured that the name Motker was spoken in every corner of the land. Her reign became synonymous with prosperity. Grain silos were full, trade routes secure, and festivals celebrated with renewed vigor. The people of Egypt, many of whom cared little for the gender of their ruler so long as the Nile flooded and food was abundant, began to accept her as pharaoh not out of fear or obligation, but out of gratitude. She became, in their eyes, the mother of the nation, protector of balance, bringer of peace. And yet, Hatshepsut was never delusional. She understood that history was fragile, that the monuments she built could one day be torn down, the records defaced, her name forgotten. But she also understood something deeper, that memory is not solely written in stone, but in the lives of those who flourish under wise rule. Her mission was not immortality, it was order. Her legacy would be the Egypt she left behind, whole and radiant, ready for the next era. As Thutmose III stood on the cusp of manhood, the question of succession loomed larger. Would he accept the throne as her equal? Would he forgive the years of shadow she had cast over his light? Or would he seek to reclaim what he saw as his by right? Those answers, like many truths buried beneath the sands of time, would come later. For now, the land of the Nile flowed steady and golden, and its people raised their eyes not to a god-king of tradition, but to a woman who had dared to shape the impossible into reality, and succeeded. As the years passed, Hatshepsut's transformation from royal consort to pharaoh was no longer a matter of controversy but of fact. The temples had declared her divine, the artists had reshaped her image, and the state had bowed to her will. What had once been whispered in skepticism was now chiseled into stone. She was Motker, beloved of Ammonius, the ruler of the two lands. But while her grasp on the symbols of power had solidified, her focus turned elsewhere, to the very infrastructure of the Egyptian empire. Her Egypt was not content with continuity. It demanded grandeur. The architecture of her reign became its own language, a visual proclamation of authority and vision. Across the Nile Valley, the country buzzed with activity. Quarrymen carved massive blocks of sandstone from the cliffs of Gebel el-Silsila. Builders hauled obelisks taller than any erected before. Carpenters, masons, and artisans worked under the blazing sun, carving the name of Hatshepsut into the legacy of every city and shrine. At Karnak, the religious heart of Egypt, her ambitions reached skyward. The Temple of Ammonius was already a monument of spiritual grandeur, but under Hatshepsut's direction, it grew more intricate and symbolic. She commissioned the construction of the Red Chapel, a structure of polished stone panels recounting her coronation, her lineage, and her divine selection. Each relief was a declaration not just of her legitimacy, but of the cosmic necessity of her rule. Most stunning of all was the erection of two towering obelisks at Karnak, symbols of solar divinity and royal strength. One of them stood over 29 meters tall, its tip plated in electrum to reflect the light of Ra. Transporting and raising such a monument was no ordinary feat. It required logistical brilliance, immense manpower, and divine approval. Her inscriptions did not shy from the magnitude of the task. She spoke directly to future generations, saying, "Now my heart turns this way and that, in thinking what the people will say, who shall see my monument in years to come and shall speak of what I have done." But her legacy was not built on stone alone. Just as her monuments rose into the sky, her reach extended across the seas. Hatshepsut understood that military conquest, while glorious drained resources and stirred unrest. Trade, on the other hand, built alliances, enriched the treasury, and brought luxury to the royal court. Her foreign policy, therefore, was rooted in exchange, not domination. The expedition to Punt had set a precedent. Now, Egyptian ships became a regular sight along the Red Sea and Mediterranean routes. Her merchants brought back lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedarwood from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, and resins from Arabia. These goods were not merely indulgences. They became tools of diplomacy and domestic power. Foreign wealth adorned temples, filled warehouses, and allowed her to reward loyalty across the social strata. Domestically, she invested in the agricultural heart of the Nile. The annual inundation was still the lifeblood of Egypt, and Hatshepsut ensured that irrigation canals were maintained and granaries stocked. During her reign, there were no major famines, no peasant uprisings, no large-scale revolts. Her control over the provinces, both administrative and symbolic, kept the kingdom running smoothly, an achievement as critical as any military conquest. And while peace reigned, culture flourished. Her patronage of the arts went beyond the practical. Sculptors were granted new freedoms to explore expression within the bounds of divine representation. Painters experimented with color and narrative in tombs and temples. Scribes recorded not only her deeds but also myths, medical texts, and observations of the stars. Education, though reserved for the elite, found renewed purpose under her reign. The royal schools trained a new generation of administrators loyal to the throne, many of whom would serve long into Thutmose III's rule. But behind the pageantry of order, a quiet conflict brewed. Thutmose III, now entering manhood, remained co-ruler in name but not in function. His royal seal appeared on few decrees, his likeness rarely depicted beside Hatshepsut's. In many of the grand temples and ceremonial scenes, he was relegated to a secondary position or omitted entirely. He was raised within the palace, trained in military arts, educated in royal traditions, but he walked in the shadow of a woman whose power refused to recede. The dynamic between them was complex, forged by politics more than affection. Hatshepsut had never denied him his royal blood, but she had used it to buttress her own position. The longer she reigned, the more difficult it became to imagine him stepping forward as a true equal. Whether she feared instability or genuinely believed herself the better ruler, she continued to command the throne long after most regents would have stepped aside. Still, she was not careless. She arranged for Thutmose to gain military experience, perhaps as a way to pacify his ambitions. He led minor campaigns in Nubia and the Levant, securing Egypt's southern and northeastern borders. These operations, though limited, gave him a taste of command and kept his growing support among the army from turning restless. Hatshepsut, for her part, focused on expanding her legacy beyond her own lifetime. She had no surviving sons to succeed her, and the question of succession weighed heavily. To ensure continuity, she promoted loyal officials into key roles. One such figure was Senenmut, a commoner-turned-architect, administrator, and royal confidant. His rise was meteoric, and his influence was unprecedented. He oversaw the construction of her greatest projects, including Deir el-Bahari, and his name appeared in inscriptions near hers, an honor rarely afforded to non-royals. Rumors swirled around their relationship. Some whispered of romance, others of conspiracy. But whatever their private dynamic, in public Senenmut served as a pillar of her administration. His tomb, though never completed, bore inscriptions that aligned his fate with hers, a testament to the loyalty he commanded and the risks he took in serving a female pharaoh. Even as her reign entered its second decade, Hatshepsut remained vigilant. She continued to build, to trade, to conduct ritual observances with the precision of a priest-king. She traveled across Egypt, appearing in public ceremonies that reinforced her image as the divine mediator between the gods and her people. In every city, her name was engraved on stelae, her figure carved beside Ammonius, Ra, and Hathor. Her image, half woman, half god, became the face of stability in a world where chaos always loomed just beyond the desert. But no ruler lives forever, and even the most enduring monuments cannot protect against time. Hatshepsut's health, once vibrant, began to falter. Signs of fatigue appeared in her court appearances. Her face, once sculpted with youthful confidence, took on the weary grace of experience. She withdrew from public life gradually, entrusting more duties to her officials and quietly preparing for the inevitable. She did not name a new successor. Instead, she allowed the architecture of power to shift naturally back toward Thutmose III. Temples that had once echoed only her name began to include his again. Statues showed him standing beside the gods. Royal inscriptions, while still favoring her legacy, now hinted at a future ruled by the young king she had once overshadowed. Her final years were spent at el-Bahari, the temple she had built not only as a house of worship, but as a mausoleum and a message to eternity. There, surrounded by the colonnades and reliefs that told the story of her reign, she prepared herself for the afterlife. She ensured that her burial would follow the traditions of kings, not queens. She ordered her sarcophagus to be placed alongside her father's in the Valley of the Kings, a statement of lineage and legitimacy as profound as any proclamation. When she died, there was no great upheaval, no civil war, no succession crisis. Thutmose III stepped into the full mantle of pharaoh with a court, a treasury, and an empire intact. The transition was smooth by design or by destiny. Yet what followed was less kind. In the years after her death, Thutmose III began a campaign to erase her from history. Her name was chiseled out of temple walls. Her statues were destroyed or recarved. Her images were defaced. In some cases, her accomplishments were reattributed to male predecessors or to Thutmose himself. The reasons remain debated: vengeance, political necessity, or the pressures of restoring male supremacy, but the effect was clear: an attempt to silence the memory of a woman who had once ruled as a king. But memory, like the Nile, has its own current, and the truth of her reign, the peace she preserved, the prosperity she fostered, the boldness of her claim, survived in stone, waiting to be rediscovered. Centuries later, when archaeologists unearthed the traces of her rule, they were stunned by its magnitude. What had once been dismissed as a regent's interlude revealed itself as a golden chapter in Egyptian history. Hatshepsut, the woman who had dared to wear the beard of a king, rose once more, not in flesh, but in legend. And as her legacy unfolded before the modern world, a new question emerged. Was she the exception, or had history simply forgotten the other women who had once held the sun in their hands? The story of Hatshepsut had not ended. It had merely been waiting, carved in limestone, whispered in hieroglyphs, glowing in the desert light, for a voice to carry it forward once more. In the hush that followed Hatshepsut's death, Egypt exhaled. The transition of power had occurred not with clashing swords or palace intrigue, but with a seamless glide that only a meticulously engineered reign could deliver. Thutmose III, long overshadowed and quietly groomed in the background, now stood fully in the sun. The empire was his, its temples, its armies, its bureaucracy, and its people. But he did not begin his reign as a mere continuation of hers. Instead, he initiated something more radical, more unsettling. With chisels and hammers, with the orders of scribes and priests, he began to unwrite her. The campaign of erasure began quietly. At first, the changes were subtle. Names scratched out on stone walls, images of a female figure recarved into the likeness of a man. Inscriptions altered so that her monuments appeared to belong to her male predecessors. Then it grew bolder. Statues were toppled, records reattributed, and the story of Egypt rewritten with Thutmose III as the uninterrupted heir to Thutmose II. Where once there had been dual rule, there was now a fabricated narrative of sole kingship. Hatshepsut, once Motker, the living embodiment of divine order, was reduced to a footnote or worse, a void. Historians still debate the motivations behind this orchestrated forgetting. Was it revenge for years of political eclipse? A calculated move to consolidate male legitimacy? Or simply the product of tradition recoiling from a reign that had challenged its core assumptions? Perhaps it was all these things, compounded by the whispers of court advisors, the ambitions of priests, and the need to assert a clear lineage after 2 decades of female rule. Whatever the reason, the outcome was brutal. An attempt not just to deny her memory, but to make it as though she had never existed. But memory, especially one carved into temples and painted across the walls of tombs, is not so easily destroyed. Though her name was defaced, her structures remained. The mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, too massive to erase, still bore the unmistakable traces of her architectural vision. The obelisks at Karnak, though partially hidden, stood as monolithic witnesses to a woman who had commanded the nation's heart. The artifacts of her reign, jewelry, statues, fragments of papyri, continued to whisper her story across time. As Thutmose III moved forward with his own rule, he did not squander the foundations she had laid. In fact, he built upon them with precision and ambition. He became one of Egypt's greatest warrior kings, expanding the empire's borders deeper into the Levant and further south into Nubia. His military campaigns were swift and decisive, creating a web of tributary states and client kingdoms. Egypt's wealth soared, and so did its global influence. In many ways, it was Hatshepsut's policies, her stabilized economy, her repaired infrastructure, her disciplined administration, that had made such expansion possible. Yet her name was absent from the victories he claimed. The Golden Empire that blossomed bore the stamp of a king who stood on her shoulders but chose not to speak her name. And yet, while Thutmose III was focused on conquest, the people of Egypt continued to live in the shadows of her monuments. Farmers still passed her images as they brought offerings to temples. Pilgrims still climbed the steps of Deir el-Bahari. Children still played beneath obelisks inscribed with her divine epithets. Her likeness, even when mutilated, still held form. Erasure is never absolute. It is always incomplete, always haunted by the trace of what was. Generations passed. The dynasty shifted. New pharaohs came and went, and with them, new myths, new alliances, new visions of eternity. The story of Hatshepsut slipped deeper into obscurity, buried beneath layers of revision and denial. By the time of the later dynasties, she had become a phantom, an unnamed ruler, an anomaly in the king lists, a blank space where a reign should have been. Then Egypt fell to foreign powers. First the Persians, then the Greeks under Alexander, then the Romans. Each conqueror layered their own culture over the sands of the Nile, transforming temples into shrines, statues into curiosities, hieroglyphs into mysteries. The knowledge of how to read the language of the ancients faded. Hatshepsut, along with countless other rulers, was entombed not just in stone but in silence. It was not until thousands of years later, in the modern era, that her story would rise again. In the 19th century, European explorers and archaeologists descended upon Egypt in a wave of excavation and colonial fascination. Among them were scholars who began to piece together the fractured history of its ancient rulers. Temples were cleared of debris, tombs opened, artifacts catalogued and shipped to museums across the world. One name began to surface repeatedly: Motkher. At first, it was assumed to belong to a male pharaoh, as the iconography suggested. But inconsistencies in the inscriptions, anomalies in the pronouns, and a growing body of evidence pointed to something extraordinary. This pharaoh had been a woman. The realization was slow and resisted by some scholars. The idea that a woman had ruled as king, not queen, not regent, but as the pharaoh himself, disrupted long-held assumptions about gender and power in the ancient world. But the evidence was irrefutable. Statues with delicate facial features wearing false beards. Titles once exclusive to kings applied to a female body. Scenes of divine coronation that depicted a woman standing not beside the gods, but in their place. Her identity could no longer be denied. The discovery of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari was the breakthrough. In the carvings along its walls, the full arc of her reign was laid bare, from royal birth to regency to pharaoh, to divine embodiment. The story she had written for eternity, once obscured by successors, re-emerged in brilliant detail. Egyptologists now had a name to match the monuments: Hatshepsut. The final confirmation came in the early 21st century, with advancements in forensic archaeology and DNA testing. A previously unidentified mummy found in the Valley of the Kings was matched to a tooth in a funerary box inscribed with her name. The physical remains of Hatshepsut had been found. Not only her story, but her body had returned from oblivion. Her rediscovery sparked new interest not only in Egyptology but in global conversations about leadership, gender, and the writing of history. She became a symbol, not just of female power, but of the ways history can be manipulated, erased, and reclaimed. Museums around the world mounted exhibitions in her honor. Documentaries and books celebrated her achievements. Scholars reevaluated the scope and sophistication of her rule. What emerged was a portrait of a ruler who had wielded power with brilliance and restraint. Hatshepsut had not waged wars of ego. She had not plunged her people into chaos. She had governed with clarity, patience, and vision. Her reign was marked not by tyranny, but by prosperity. And though her image had once been chiseled from stone, her example had become unbreakable. Today, her name is spoken alongside the greatest rulers of the ancient world. Not as an anomaly, not as a curiosity, but as a pharaoh. She reminds us that power wears many faces, that leadership is not bound by gender or tradition, that history is not fixed, but ever-shifting, shaped by those who tell it and those who dare to live it differently. Hatshepsut did not conquer by sword, but by presence. She did not inherit the throne. She forged it anew, and in doing so, she carved out not only a place for herself, but a possibility for all who would come after. Her temples still stand. Her obelisks still rise. Her name, once buried, is now spoken in awe, and her legacy, once silenced, echoes louder than ever. Long after the echoes of hammer and chisel faded into the sandstone cliffs of Thebes, long after the priests who blessed her name grew old and the scribes who recorded her triumphs laid down their reed pens, the presence of Hatshepsut refused to vanish. Her breath no longer warmed the corridors of power, but her fingerprints were etched across the land she once ruled. The Nile still rose and fell beside the temples she had raised. The sun still struck the electrum caps of her obelisks. The wind still whispered through the colonnades of el-Bahari, where her story lingered like incense smoke in the cool stone air. Her enemies had tried to erase her, but in doing so, they had only called attention to the space she once occupied, and it was there, within that silence, that her eternity began. For Hatshepsut, death had not been a retreat but a final transformation. In life, she had walked the line between woman and king, divine and mortal. In death, she crossed over entirely, becoming one with the gods whose favor she had so carefully cultivated. Her tomb in the Valley of the Kings, KV-20, was the first known royal burial constructed in that hidden necropolis. Carved deep into the Theban cliffs, it tunneled further than any tomb before it, its passages winding like the path of a soul navigating the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Though her mummy would later be separated from her sarcophagus, her journey through eternity had already begun in symbols and spells. Her funerary texts, inscribed in walls and on papyri, were precise. Instructions to the soul, maps through darkness, prayers to Ra and Osiris for guidance and resurrection. In those sacred texts, she did not appear as a usurper or an anomaly. She appeared as Pharaoh. The voice speaking through them was not apologetic or hesitant. It was regal, resolute, assured of its place among the stars. As generations passed, her name faded from public memory, replaced by new kings, new wars, new gods elevated to supremacy. The 18th dynasty gave way to the 19th and then the 20th, and with them came Ramses, Seti, and Merneptah. The Egyptian empire swelled and fractured, its borders shifting like desert sands. Foreigners came and conquered, some adopting its ways, others stripping it bare. The language changed. The script was lost. And yet the stones remained. The monuments she built stood watch through earthquakes and floods, through plundering and time. They endured like bones beneath the skin of a vanished body. Then came the rediscovery. Centuries after her reign, in the height of the 19th century, as colonial powers turned Egypt into a theater of curiosity and conquest, the sands began to part again. Adventurers, grave robbers, and early archaeologists, some earnest, others ravenous, descended upon the Nile Valley in search of treasure, knowledge, and glory. Among the shattered statues and half-buried temples, they found fragments. A name half-erased here, a face softened by vandalism there. The story was disjointed, confusing. Who was this king with a woman's features? Why did the inscriptions refer to a daughter of Ammonius as a pharaoh? The official king lists made no mention of her. The tombs seemed to contradict themselves. But piece by piece the narrative emerged. Jean-François Champollion's deciphering of the Rosetta Stone unlocked the language of ancient Egypt, and with it came revelations. The erased names were reassembled. The monuments began to speak again. A clearer picture formed of a ruler named Hatshepsut, one who had not merely served as queen or regent, but who had claimed the full power of kingship and held it for over 2 decades. Still, some resisted the truth. The Victorian lens, shaped by patriarchal norms and limited by colonial imagination, struggled with the idea of a woman commanding an empire in antiquity. Some scholars insisted she had been a placeholder, a passive bridge between father and son. Others questioned the legitimacy of her reign. But as excavation continued, her achievements became impossible to ignore. The grandeur of el-Bahari, the inscriptions in Karnak, the logistics of the Punt expedition, the massive scale of her building programs, all pointed to a ruler of unmatched ambition and capability. By the time the 20th century arrived, Hatshepsut had become a subject of fascination. Egyptologists studied her reign not only to understand her time, but to question the very structure of power in ancient civilizations. Feminist scholars reclaimed her as an icon. Historians debated whether she had ruled out of necessity, opportunism, or destiny. Biographers examined the tension between her maternal imagery and her masculine regalia, her divine myth-making and her practical governance. In all these studies, one truth remained constant. She had redefined what was possible. But it was not until 2007 that her story came full circle. In the basement of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, a mummy long labeled as unknown was matched to a tooth found in a funerary box bearing her name. The jawbone fit perfectly. DNA and CT scans confirmed what many had suspected. The body was Hatshepsut's. After centuries of exile from her identity, her remains had returned to her name. Forensic analysis revealed a woman who had suffered from arthritis, dental disease, and possibly diabetes. Her body bore the signs of age and pain, but also of dignity. She had not died in battle, nor by betrayal. She had passed from the world like so many of her people, quietly, with the rituals of her faith and the honors of her station. Her face, reconstructed digitally, bore a calm and intelligent expression, with strong cheekbones and a narrow jaw. It was not the face of a conqueror or a tyrant. It was the face of a stateswoman, one who had read the stars and the scrolls, one who had stood before gods and armies and held her ground. In today's Egypt, her legacy is both preserved and complicated. Modern Egyptians, living in a land far different from that of the New Kingdom, view her through the lens of national pride, cultural identity, and historical intrigue. Tourists visit her temple and speak her name aloud, unaware that for centuries it had been forbidden, even forgotten. School children learn of her achievements alongside those of Tutankhamun and Ramses. But for all the fanfare, her story remains a mirror, reflecting the values of each age that rediscovers her. In the West, she has become a case study in lost history and the power of recovery. Her name appears in textbooks, in documentaries, in novels and films. She is discussed in lectures about gender, power, and politics. Her reign is taught not just as a chapter of Egyptian history, but as a meditation on how societies choose to remember or forget their pioneers. And still, questions remain. Was her rule accepted by the people or simply endured? Did she act out of love for Egypt or hunger for control? Was her erasure orchestrated by a resentful stepson or by generations of priests and scribes unwilling to let her memory live? Did she believe, as she claimed, that she had been chosen by Ammonius himself? Or was that divine lineage crafted as a necessary fiction to hold a kingdom together? These are questions the stones cannot answer. The silence in the damaged inscriptions will not speak. But perhaps they don't need to, because what matters most is not what she claimed or what others denied, but what remains. Her works, her vision, her legacy. She built not just temples and obelisks, but an idea that leadership could take a new form, that tradition could bend without breaking, that greatness did not always wear a beard or wield a sword. Her reign, though brief in the span of millennia, offered a blueprint for possibility. It suggested that power could be reshaped, reimagined, and recast, even if the world wasn't ready for it. And now, as the desert winds continue to blow across the ruins of her time, as cameras flash and tour guides speak her name, as scholars publish her story and artists paint her likeness, Hatshepsut lives on. Not in the gilded halls of immortality, but in the collective memory of a world still learning how to see her. The pharaoh who became a ghost, the ghost who became a legend, the legend who became eternal. In the long arc of civilization, the legacy of a ruler is measured not only by what they build or destroy, but by what they leave behind in the rhythms of everyday life, the steady beat of commerce, the rituals of faith, the structure of governance. Hatshepsut's reign was not merely a glittering chapter in the royal annals of Egypt. It was a recalibration of empire itself. In the 2 decades she ruled as pharaoh, she did more than seize power. She redesigned the operating system of Egyptian authority, and long after her death, the system she engineered continued to function with remarkable durability. The hallmark of her rule was stability. When she took power, Egypt had emerged from a chaotic period of internal disputes and short-lived reigns. The line of kings, though illustrious in name, had grown tenuous in execution. Hatshepsut understood that the true foundation of kingship was not divine birth alone, but the ability to hold together a nation whose borders stretched from the deserts of Libya to the cataracts of Nubia. She governed not as a monarch chasing glory, but as an architect laying the groundwork for longevity. The administrative structure she inherited was vast but fragmented. Provincial governors, known as nomarchs, often operated with considerable independence, and local temples held immense wealth and influence. Hatshepsut did not attempt to dismantle these powers directly. Instead, she integrated them into her vision of centralized governance. By rewarding loyalty, reassigning critical posts, and investing heavily in regional development, she turned potential rivals into stakeholders. Under her watch, bureaucracy became an instrument of cohesion rather than corruption. She surrounded herself with a cadre of trusted advisors, many of whom rose from humble origins. Figures like Senenmut, her steward, architect, and confidant, exemplified a new kind of elite, educated, loyal, and administratively brilliant. Senenmut's management of state-building projects, from obelisks to temples, was not just a demonstration of technical skill, but of bureaucratic excellence. The careful accounting of materials, labor forces, and timelines bore the hallmark of a system that valued precision over pomp. Beyond the bureaucracy, Hatshepsut focused her attention on Egypt's lifeblood, the economy. Trade flourished under her rule not by accident but by design. She recognized that a prosperous Egypt required not only internal harvests, but external connections. The famed expedition to the land of Punt was only the most dramatic example. Throughout her reign, trade routes were strengthened, maritime travel improved, and foreign emissaries welcomed. Her administration standardized weights and measures, streamlined the taxation system, and kept the state granaries well-stocked against times of scarcity. The result was an Egypt flush with exotic goods, skilled labor, and wealth. Myrrh trees carried root and all from Punt, were planted in the gardens of her temples. Incense, copper, ebony, leopard skins, and apes, all once rare curiosities, became accessible to the priesthood and aristocracy alike. These imports not only enriched daily life, they infused religious rituals with splendor and sensory depth. The gods, she believed, deserved the best the world could offer, and Egypt, under her guidance, would provide it. At the heart of her economic strategy was the relationship between temple and state. Egyptian religion was not a separate realm but an extension of governance. Temples were centers of learning, agriculture, and commerce. By aligning herself closely with Ammonius, the chief deity of Thebes, Hatshepsut ensured that the largest and wealthiest temple in Egypt served as a spiritual and administrative ally. The Temple of Karnak, expanded during her reign, became both a house of worship and a monument to her political acumen. Her red chapel, a jewel of polished stone and divine iconography, stood as a narrative in relief, one that proclaimed not just piety but statecraft. Her most ambitious temple, el-Bahari, was not only a mortuary site but a political statement. Built into the cliffs of western Thebes, its design mirrored the natural geometry of the mountains, while introducing a new architectural vocabulary. The terraces, colonnades, and ramps guided visitors not just through space, but through ideology. Every panel, every statue, every inscription told a story of divine right, peaceful reign, and the pharaoh who brought balance to the two lands. It was not merely a tomb, it was a machine for memory. But beyond temples and trade, Hatshepsut was a master of symbolism. In a society where the image of the king was inseparable from the idea of divine order, she reinvented herself without fracturing the system. Her portrayal as a male pharaoh was not a denial of her femininity but a recalibration of royal iconography. Statues showed her with a broad chest, false beard, and traditional headdress not because she pretended to be a man, but because the role of pharaoh demanded those visual cues. In her inscriptions, she oscillated between feminine and masculine pronouns, depending on context and audience. This fluidity was revolutionary, not because it subverted gender, but because it used tradition to transcend it. Through this calculated duality, Hatshepsut maintained legitimacy in the eyes of both the elite and the populace. She did not present herself as a break in the dynastic line, but as its natural continuation, born of Thutmose I, chosen by the gods, and protector of the realm until Thutmose III could take his place. The co-regency was a delicate fiction, one that allowed her to consolidate power while avoiding overt conflict. And it worked. The absence of civil unrest during her reign speaks to the effectiveness of her political choreography. Education flourished under her. The scribal schools, often attached to temples, trained a new generation of administrators, record-keepers, and architects. Literacy, while still limited to the elite, expanded in purpose. Medical texts, legal codes, and astronomical observations from her reign suggest an intellectual vitality that went hand in hand with spiritual devotion. The priests of Ammonius were not merely ritualists, they were scientists, historians, and engineers. In the field of art, her reign saw innovation wrapped in reverence. While traditional forms were respected, artisans began experimenting with depth, motion, and proportion. Reliefs depicted her divine birth with a level of narrative complexity rare in earlier periods. In these scenes, the god Ammonius visits her mother in disguise, declaring the future greatness of the child to come. These myths were not merely decorative, they were strategic. By weaving herself into the cosmology of the gods, Hatshepsut ensured that her right to rule could not be questioned without questioning the heavens themselves. Even as her legacy was later challenged, the sheer volume of her contributions made erasure difficult. The structures she commissioned, the systems she established, and the wealth she generated left fingerprints across every stratum of Egyptian society. Her rule had not been an aberration, it had been a masterclass in sovereign adaptability. But what truly set her apart was her refusal to govern through fear. Unlike some of her successors who ruled with displays of brutality and divine wrath, Hatshepsut led with equilibrium. Her titles emphasized not conquest but harmony: God's wife of Ammonius, mistress of the two lands, one who embraces Mot. She did not need to threaten revolt or summon fire from the gods. Her power flowed from competence, clarity, and a deep understanding of Egypt's heartbeat. Even today, her accomplishments continue to challenge the narratives we tell about power, leadership, and gender. In classrooms and museums, in documentaries and academic journals, her name invites inquiry. How did a woman rise to supreme power in a deeply patriarchal society? How did she maintain peace without conquest? How did she rewrite the rules without tearing down the game? Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Hatshepsut's legacy is its endurance. For over 3,000 years, she lay in obscurity, her name scratched out, her story truncated. And yet, when rediscovered, her reign needed no embellishment. The evidence of her greatness had always been there, in the stones that bore her mark, in the scrolls that bore her seal, in the Nile that bore her nation forward. She had not vanished. She had waited. And now, as her story returns to the public eye, it does so not as a relic, but as a revelation. In an era still grappling with the nature of authority, inclusion, and legacy, Hatshepsut offers a model both ancient and astonishingly modern. She reminds us that true power lies not in domination, but in design. Not in loudness, but in longevity. Not in imposing one's image upon the world, but in shaping the world so that one's image makes sense within it. She was Pharaoh, not in name alone, but in vision, in structure, in soul. And in the empire she engineered, that truth remains. When the tide of time buries a name beneath layers of stone and silence, what remains is never the silence itself, but the resonance of what was once too powerful to forget. Hatshepsut, though struck from the annals by the chisel of succession, remained imprinted in the fabric of Egypt, not merely in its temples, not only in the myths etched into limestone, but in the very machinery of empire that continued to run long after her death. Her story was not simply a rise and fall. It was a stratification, a reign preserved in architecture, policy, and the geometry of belief, lying dormant until the modern world was ready to unearth her. As Thutmose III grew into his own rule after her passing, he did not dismantle the foundations she had laid. He expanded Egypt's borders with military vigor, launching campaigns that brought new riches and vassals under the Egyptian crown. His was a reign of conquest, forged in steel and strategy, earning him the moniker Napoleon of Egypt by later historians. Yet even as he inscribed victory after victory onto temple walls, his empire marched on a road paved by Hatshepsut's peace. Her economic policies had filled the coffers. Her administrative refinements had steadied the court. Her focus on diplomacy over domination had left the kingdom unfractured and ripe for expansion. And so, even as her statues were broken and her cartouches scratched out, her invisible hand guided the nation she had once ruled. The attempt to erase her had consequences more symbolic than structural. The defacement of monuments was not wholesale demolition, it was revision. Her statues were defaced but not destroyed, her images overwritten but not lost. In many cases, the outline of her figure remained, her erased name replaced with those of her male predecessors or successors, a gesture as much about restoring patriarchal norms as about asserting a linear history. But stone remembers, and the absences she left behind, blank cartouches, figures oddly masculine yet unmistakably feminine, became the clues through which she would be resurrected. In the centuries that followed, Egypt fell under the rule of Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. Each brought their own deities, their own bureaucracies, their own interpretations of kingship. Yet none managed to replace the ancient reverence for divine monarchy as practiced in Hatshepsut's time. Cleopatra would later wield feminine power wrapped in Egyptian and Hellenistic symbolism. But even she would not rule with the same architectural and ideological innovation as the woman who preceded her by over a millennium. Hatshepsut had ruled at a time when pharaohs were considered gods on earth, and she had placed herself at the center of that divinity without apology or disguise. By the time modern archaeologists set foot upon the sands of el-Bahari, her story had become a mystery wrapped in contradiction. Her temple, half-buried and partially ruined, still radiated symmetry and grandeur. Early explorers mistook her for a male king. Others speculated she had ruled only briefly, or as a figurehead. It wasn't until the hieroglyphs were deciphered, the cartouches cross-referenced, and the architecture analyzed, that the truth began to emerge. Slowly, she was pulled back from the margins of history and returned to the center. This rediscovery was not merely archaeological, it was ideological. In an era increasingly questioning the narratives of patriarchy and colonialism, Hatshepsut's story became a point of reflection. What other legacies had been buried, not because they failed, but because they threatened a dominant narrative? Her erasure was no accident of time, it was a deliberate act of political hygiene. And yet, the very forces that tried to remove her had preserved her by leaving the infrastructure of her reign intact. Like a watermark under a palimpsest, she had never truly disappeared. Modern technologies would accelerate this restoration. Ground-penetrating radar, 3D scanning, forensic anthropology, all tools of a new age of curiosity, were turned toward her tomb, her statues, her remains. The box bearing her name and containing a tooth, long misfiled in the museum's storage, would become the key to identifying her mummified body. Her skeleton told its own story. Dental disease, possible diabetes, cancer. A life lived in grandeur, but not without suffering. She had walked the halls of Karnak with pain in her bones, even as she commanded the loyalty of a kingdom. Even her temple at el-Bahari, once targeted for destruction, was slowly and lovingly restored. Teams of Egyptian and international archaeologists worked for decades to piece back the shattered columns, clean the soot from the reliefs, and stabilize the sandstone. As each layer was uncovered, the narrative became clearer, not only of Hatshepsut's reign, but of the world she shaped. A world of trade winds and divine rituals, of geopolitical balance and cosmic alignment. What was it, then, that made her reign so enduring, even in the face of erasure? Perhaps it was the multiplicity she embodied. Hatshepsut was neither the first woman to wield power in Egypt nor the last. But she was the one who did so by absorbing the entire apparatus of kingship into her image. She did not stand beside a king. She became the king. She did not challenge the system. She reprogrammed it. In her hands, kingship was not fixed, but fluid, an amalgam of tradition and necessity, form and function, mask and mirror. Her reign was both a continuation and a deviation, an anomaly that fit so seamlessly into the system it became a model in its own right. She governed with an attention to detail that modern statesmen would envy. From the design of her monuments to the inscriptions on her obelisks, she curated every symbol of her authority. Her artisans crafted a consistent visual language that reinforced her legitimacy. Her scribes recorded histories that placed her birth not in the cradle of dynastic politics but in the hands of the gods. She staged her rule like a ritual, where every gesture, every festival, every building, every public decree was part of a larger drama of stability and divine order. And yet, within that spectacle was a profound pragmatism. Her decision to rule, her methods of consolidation, her administrative policies, they all point to a ruler grounded in reality. She knew that temples needed funding, that soldiers needed grain, that the gods needed pageantry, and that the people needed bread. She walked the line between ideology and infrastructure with grace, always mindful that her reign would be judged not only by the gods above, but by the generations to come. Today, visitors stand before the reliefs at el-Bahari and read the story of a god descending to father a child, of a girl anointed by divinity, of a woman crowned by heaven. They see the ships returning from Punt, the priests blessing the obelisks, the armies standing at attention. They see Hatshepsut not as a footnote, but as a full chapter, a ruler who once reigned over the richest and most stable period in Egyptian history. And they ask, how could such a figure have been forgotten? The answer lies not in her absence, but in the presence of those who feared her memory. History, after all, is often less about what happened than about who is allowed to speak. Hatshepsut's story, long silenced, now speaks again. Through stone and inscription, through science and scholarship, through awe and admiration. She is no longer a phantom in the royal lineage, no longer a mystery carved in half-truths. She is a testament to what endures: vision, resilience, and the quiet force of legacy. The sands of Egypt may shift, the Nile may flood and recede, the kingdoms of men may rise and fall, but Hatshepsut remains, not merely as a name but as a question, not merely as a queen but as a pharaoh, not merely as a ruler but as a reckoning. The years after Hatshepsut's death passed like wind over desert rock, steady, grinding, unrelenting. The temples she built still stood, towering in solemn brilliance, yet her name no longer echoed in their halls. The mortuary chants once sung in her honor fell silent. Statues that bore her likeness were toppled or reshaped. In the scrolls and king lists compiled by later scribes, she became a ghost, omitted with precision, her reign reduced to a footnote, if acknowledged at all. And yet, despite this erasure, the architecture of her rule proved immune to destruction. The systems she had put into place, strong central administration, stabilized trade routes, a delicate balance between priesthood and monarchy, remained intact. The prosperity that followed, especially under Thutmose IIIth, was not a sudden ascent but the continuation of a carefully laid foundation. Even as he campaigned across Syria and Canaan, expanding Egypt's borders in blood and bronze, he relied upon the machinery Hatshepsut had constructed in peace. Still, her memory had been exiled. At Karnak, her obelisks were surrounded by walls to obscure them from view. At Deir el-Bahari, her carved face was methodically erased, one chisel stroke at a time. Even her tomb in the Valley of the Kings, hidden deep within the cliffs, was stripped of regal association, repurposed or forgotten. The world moved forward, as it always does, rarely looking back. But history is not linear. It circles like the sun, illuminating forgotten spaces in time. And beneath the sands of Thebes, her legacy waited. Centuries passed. Dynasties collapsed. Foreign powers came and went. Greeks, Romans, Byzantines. Each added their layers of myth and governance, carving their own names into Egypt's story. The knowledge of hieroglyphs faded. Temples crumbled. The Nile changed course. What was once divine became debris. Yet through all of it, the foundations of Hatshepsut's legacy remained, buried but unbroken. It wasn't until the early 19th century that her name began to stir again, rising like dust before a windstorm. As European powers pushed into Egypt in search of treasure and glory, so too did scholars begin the slow process of resurrecting the past. Tombs were entered. Temples were mapped. Fragments of statues were collected and catalogued. Among the most magnificent sights was Deir el-Bahari, its symmetry, its cliff-hugging terraces, its elegance so distinct that even untrained eyes could see it had been the work of genius. But the mystery remained. Who had built it? At first, credit was given to Thutmose IIIth. After all, his name adorned many parts of the site, recarved, often over something earlier. But inconsistencies emerged. Some reliefs bore traces of a different cartouche. Some statues clearly represented a ruler in masculine regalia, yet with feminine proportions. Scholars puzzled over the odd depictions. A pharaoh with a false beard and broad chest, yet delicate features, hips, and eyes unmistakably feminine. The name Motker appeared often, her throne name, and though later lists of rulers skipped her entirely, the walls had not forgotten. In small corners untouched by chisels, in statues hidden beneath collapsed columns, the story of Hatshepsut survived, not as a whisper, but as a shout muffled by time. Still, confusion reigned. Early Egyptologists hesitated to believe that a woman could have ruled as pharaoh with full authority. The prevailing assumptions of the era, steeped in Victorian ideologies, struggled to reconcile power with femininity. Some postulated that she had merely acted as regent. Others suggested she was a usurper. A few even believed the depictions were symbolic or misinterpreted. It would take decades of excavation, comparison, and reconsideration for the truth to crystallize. Piece by piece, her identity was restored. The discovery of Senenmut's tomb helped clarify her administration. The Temple of Karnak offered glimpses of her original obelisks. And at Deir el-Bahari, beneath layers of dust and political revision, her narrative began to reemerge in full. What had been struck out could now be read again. What had been buried was being unearthed. The shape of her story became clearer. Daughter of Thutmose I, wife of Thutmose II, stepmother to Thutmose III, regent, then king. Not queen, not co-ruler, but pharaoh. Still, one puzzle remained: the location of her body. For years, Egyptologists speculated. Her original tomb, KV-20, was long known, deep and serpentine in its descent into the Theban rock. It was unlike any tomb before it, designed not as a chamber, but a procession into the underworld. Her sarcophagus was there, but empty. Another was found in KV-60, containing an unidentified female mummy. In storage, a funerary box bearing her name sat overlooked for decades. Inside it, a single tooth. Only in the early 2000s did science provide the key. CT scans, DNA testing, and forensic analysis revealed the match. The tooth from her box belonged to the mummy in KV-60. After millennia of silence, Hatshepsut had been found. She had lived into her late 40s or early 50s. Her skeleton bore signs of illness, possibly diabetes, cancer, and dental infection. Yet her physical suffering had not stopped her from building monuments, commanding fleets, and ruling a civilization. When the identification was confirmed, it made headlines around the world. For the first time in modern memory, her name was spoken not as mystery or myth, but as fact. Museums began hosting exhibitions in her name. Documentaries were produced. Books were written. Feminist historians embraced her as a symbol of repressed power, while Egyptologists debated the implications of her reign on traditional kingship. Tourists walked her temple again, this time not in confusion but in reverence. Scholars retranslated inscriptions once believed to be errors. She was no longer the anomaly, she was the revelation. Yet, as her story returned to light, it became clear that her greatest legacy was not her temple, nor her trade routes, nor even her erasure and rediscovery. It was the possibility she represented. The possibility that tradition can evolve, that power can transcend gender, that leadership can wear any form when guided by clarity, purpose, and vision. Hatshepsut's name now stands among the greatest rulers of antiquity, not because she demanded it, but because time finally allowed the world to see what she had built. And in doing so, it confirmed what she always knew, that the truest monuments are not those made of stone, but of order, imagination, and the courage to rule when no one expected it. What does it mean for a name to disappear and yet never be forgotten? For centuries, Hatshepsut's legacy endured in paradox. A life remembered by monuments yet denied by history, a reign etched into stone yet scrubbed from record. Her successors had sought to silence her memory, chiseling her likeness from temple walls and removing her cartouches from king lists. And for generations it seemed they had succeeded. But the very empire she had built, the stones she had commanded into shape, the policies she had written into the bones of Egypt, all bore her signature even when her name was missing. Hatshepsut's erasure was never complete because her legacy was not only in the narrative, but in the architecture of the nation itself. In the centuries after her death, the name Hatshepsut grew quiet. The great dynasties that followed, the Ramessides with their towering colossi, the Sate kings with their cautious diplomacy, the Ptolemies with their fusion of Greek and Egyptian identity, all carried echoes of her innovation, yet rarely her name. Egypt evolved, adapted, resisted, and fell first to Persia, then to Alexander, then to Rome. By the time Cleopatra ruled, Egypt was a land of layered memories, and Hatshepsut's place among them had blurred into myth or vanished altogether. And yet, through the silence, her temple stood, Deir el-Bahari was not forgotten. Travelers marveled at its symmetry, its commanding rise from the Theban cliffs, its colonnades still catching the desert light. Though few understood the language carved into its stone, they sensed its power. Inscriptions, though damaged, retained their grace. Columns broken by time still stood like sentinels. The site bore witness not only to her story but to the fragility of memory and the resilience of truth. The 19th and early 20th centuries brought Egypt into sharp focus for the modern world. Colonial powers, spurred by competition and wonder, turned the Nile Valley into a theater of excavation. Archaeologists and adventurers scoured tombs and temples, retrieving artifacts that would fill the glass cases of museums from London to Paris to Berlin. In this frenzy of rediscovery, Hatshepsut's image emerged again, not as a queen consort, not as a caretaker of a boy king, but as a pharaoh. It was not an easy revelation. For years, scholars debated whether Motker, the throne name that adorned her monuments, had belonged to a man. The art of her reign showed her with the false beard, the broad chest, the traditional posture of masculine kingship. Yet other elements, delicate features, pronouns in inscriptions, mentions of His Majesty, herself, told a more complex story. Gradually, the pieces aligned. A female ruler had taken on the full powers and regalia of kingship, not as pretense, but as purpose. This discovery upended assumptions, not just about Egypt but about history itself. For generations, the idea of a woman wielding such absolute power, and doing so successfully, had been relegated to myth or exception. Hatshepsut was neither. She had governed as pharaoh for over 20 years, maintained peace, expanded commerce, built enduring monuments, and innovated within the framework of tradition. She had ruled not as a substitute but as a sovereign. In the 21st century, scientific advancement allowed for even deeper revelations. DNA testing and CT scans of mummified remains suggested a match between the unknown woman in the Valley of the Kings and a missing tooth found in a box inscribed with Hatshepsut's name. Her face was reconstructed, revealing a high forehead, strong cheekbones, and a gaze that felt, even in digital form, both contemplative and commanding. The body bore signs of chronic illness, dental abscesses, bone deterioration, possible cancer. Her death had not been swift, but slow. And yet, even in pain, she had completed one of the most ambitious reigns in Egyptian history. This scientific resurrection reinvigorated interest in her legacy. Documentaries were made. Exhibitions traveled the world. Historians revisited earlier narratives, questioning the motivations behind her erasure. Was it vengeance from Thutmose IIIth, seeking to assert a masculine narrative of kingship? Was it the priesthood, uncomfortable with the gender fluidity her rule embodied? Was it later dynasties needing to simplify succession? Likely it was all of these, an intersection of personal, political, and ideological forces converging on one point: the refusal to accept that a woman could have ruled as king. But Hatshepsut had not waited for history's permission. She had claimed it, and now, her story resonates far beyond the stone and sand of ancient Egypt. In classrooms, she is studied as a figure of bold leadership and nuanced strategy. In conversations about gender, she stands as an early example of power redefined. In art and film, she becomes a canvas for both admiration and inquiry. And in the broader narrative of human civilization, she offers a reminder that greatness is not confined by form or tradition. It is forged by vision. Her temple at Deir el-Bahari continues to receive pilgrims, though now they come with cameras and notebooks rather than incense and offerings. They stand on the terraces she once walked, gaze at the reliefs that once proclaimed her divine birth, and try to imagine the woman who defied every norm and yet built her reign upon the very traditions she seemed to challenge. They marvel not just at the scale of the structure, but at the clarity of the idea it embodied. That power, when wielded with purpose and clarity, transcends the boxes it is meant to fit within. The Valley of the Kings, once hidden from view, is now a corridor of revelation. Her tomb, once looted and left in darkness, is studied by those seeking not treasure but understanding. The scarred inscriptions in Karnak, once meant to obscure, are now studied precisely because they reveal the effort it took to try and erase her. Every gap is a question. Every restoration is an act of reclamation. Even the silence speaks. In many ways, Hatshepsut's true reign began after her death, when history, having buried her, found itself compelled to bring her back. Her story is not merely one of power seized, but of memory resurrected. She reminds us that the past is not passive. It waits, it watches, and when the time is right, it returns with a voice sharpened by the centuries. And what does that voice say? That leadership is not a costume, but a calling. That tradition can be honored without being obeyed. That legacy cannot be destroyed, only delayed. That the most powerful stories are the ones that refuse to die. And so Hatshepsut stands, at the edge of myth and memory, woman and king erased and eternal. Not forgotten, never forgotten. In the soft light of dawn that breaks over the cliffs of western Thebes, the sun casts its golden glow upon the terraced facade of Deir el-Bahari. The columns and colonnades, weathered but proud, stand as they have for more than 3 millennia, silent witnesses to a reign that refused to vanish. Here, beneath the limestone rock face, Hatshepsut once stood as pharaoh. She stood not beside a man, not behind a throne, but at the very center of Egypt's power, commanding the loyalty of her court, the tribute of foreign lands, and the imagination of a civilization that worshipped eternity. It is fitting that her temple faces east, toward the life-giving sun, toward rebirth, toward legacy. For Hatshepsut, more than most rulers in history, understood that power is transient, but narrative is immortal. She shaped hers with a careful hand, embedding her story not in flesh and blood, but in stone and symbol. And though chisels later sought to strip those symbols away, her design proved stronger than their efforts. She had built not only for her time, but for all time. There are few rulers in history whose reigns are as paradoxical as hers. She ascended not through war, but through wit. She wielded no famous army, yet she defended a nation. She governed in a world defined by masculine authority, yet never hid who she was. She transformed the visual language of power to include her face, her name, her presence. And then, just as deliberately as she rose, she disappeared, swallowed by the twin forces of dynastic transition and institutional memory. But even in absence, she persisted. Today, her name is etched not only into the walls of her temple, but into the minds of those who study what leadership means. Her rediscovery is more than an archaeological triumph. It is a cultural reckoning. Every statue defaced, every cartouche erased, every inscription altered tells a story not of defeat, but of fear. The fear she inspired in those who followed her was not because she failed, but because she succeeded. She had shown what was possible, and that terrified a system built on limits. What makes Hatshepsut timeless is not merely that she ruled as a woman in a man's world. It is that she governed with foresight, restraint, and imagination. She forged alliances through diplomacy rather than bloodshed. She built monuments that still leave scholars and tourists in awe. She reimagined religious legitimacy not as inheritance, but as participation in the divine. Her Egypt was stable, prosperous, expansive, not through conquest, but through commerce, infrastructure, and reverence for continuity. Her vision extended beyond her own mortality. The placement of her temple, the narratives on her walls, the alignment of her statues, all point to a ruler obsessed not with personal glory, but with ensuring that the world she left behind would be coherent, functioning, and just. Even her myth-making, claiming divine birth from Ammonius, was not arrogance but strategy. In a world where theology and politics were one and the same, she knew that to rule with permanence, she had to anchor herself not just in law, but in cosmos. Yet, for all her control, she could not govern what came after. Thutmose III, in his consolidation of dynastic history, began the slow, calculated erasure of her name. Later kings continued the omission. By the time Greek historians chronicled Egypt, Her name had disappeared. She became, at best, a rumor, at worst, a blank space. For centuries, the only remnants of her reign were mute, half-buried walls, broken statues, partial inscriptions. But in that silence lay an invitation, to look deeper, to question what had been lost, and why. And when the modern world answered that invitation, what it found was more than a pharaoh. Found a challenge to how we define power, a challenge to how we record memory, a challenge to how we confront the tension between tradition and transformation. In the decades since her mummy was identified, since her face was reconstructed, since her temple was restored, Hatshepsut has become more than a figure of the past. She has become a symbol for the future. Her story has been taught in classrooms not merely as a tale of Egypt, but as a case study in perseverance, identity, and the long arc of justice. She has been invoked in conversations about women in leadership, about historical erasure, about the role of legacy in shaping culture. But Hatshepsut's greatest lesson is perhaps not political, nor even historical. It is human. She reminds us that every structure of power is built by those bold enough to imagine something different. That silence is not the end of a story, it is the pause before rediscovery. That identity, even when constrained by ritual and expectation, can be redefined through vision, through labor, through patience. She reminds us that we are not only the inheritors of history, but its caretakers. That we must ask not just who was remembered, but who was forgotten and why. That behind every blank space in a textbook, every missing name on a monument, every figure obscured by the passage of time, there may stand someone who dared to lead, to change, to build. And so now, as the sun sets over el-Bahari once more, casting its shadow across the same steps she once climbed, we do not speak of Hatshepsut as anomaly, or novelty, or footnote. We speak her name as it was meant to be spoken. Pharaoh, builder of temples, ruler of Egypt, daughter of gods, mother of legacy. She came to power in a world that offered her no throne and left behind an empire that bore her soul. And though the wind once carried away her name, history has brought it back. She is Hatshepsut. She always was, and she always will be.